Jack Sterling spat a mouthful of red blood onto the black stone and gripped the giant's ankle, forcing his broken body to stand one more time. Raxus looked down, his multi-lensed eyes whirring with clinical detachment as he raised a jagged executioner's blade. The obsidian arena was a vacuum of sound. What makes a man keep fighting when the galaxy has already written his obituary? Join us as we witness the moment a primitive pilot showed a dying empire what true nobility looks like. 9 days ago, the hardest decision Jax had faced was whether to skip breakfast or spend his last 3 credits on a synthetic protein bar. He'd been sitting in the Starskimmer's cockpit, listening to the heater rattle, blissfully unaware that a princess was about to watch her world burn. Alara Vane stood on the balcony of the Hegemony court, her hands trembling as she adjusted the heavy, velvet robes that felt more like a shroud. Below her, the great hall was a sea of shimmering opalescence and cold, calculating faces. Her father, Malachor, sat on the throne like a statue carved from salt, his skin graying from the rot of the void marrow that was slowly claiming his life. The Ravager swarm had sent their ultimatum not through a diplomat, but through a projection that filled the room with the smell of ozone and wet earth. Surrender the fringe worlds, or face extinction. The high priest stepped forward, his voice a dry rasp that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. He invoked the trial of Aegis, an ancient, bloody tradition that offered a slim chance of salvation. A noble champion had to bond with the princess, their souls entwining to face the swarm's butcher in ritual combat. But Alara was void tainted. The same energy that gave her family the right to rule was now seen as a curse, a sickness that had withered her father and darkened her own veins with ink-colored streaks. One by one, the High Lords stepped back. Her cousin Kaelin didn't even look her in the eye. He spoke of purity and the sanctity of blood, his voice dripping with a cowardice he called tradition. They would rather let the swarm devour their borders than touch the hand of a tainted royal. Alara felt the weight of their judgment like a physical blow. She was the anchor of a falling star, watching her people choose a polite death over a messy survival. High above the floor, tucked into the maintenance rafters where the shadows were thickest, Jack Sterling adjusted his cap. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was a freighter pilot with a cargo bay full of smuggled cooling coils and a ship that needed a new warp gasket. But he had a clear view of the princess's face. He saw the way she didn't beg, even as her world turned its back on her. Between his fingers, Jax flipped a small, jagged piece of Terran flint. It was a rough thing, common as dirt back home, but it felt solid in a room full of glass and ego. Is a legacy written in the blood you're born with, or the blood you're willing to spill for a stranger? Jack stood up, his boots clanging against the metal walkway. He didn't have a title, and he certainly didn't have pure blood, but as he looked down at the silent, shivering court, he realized he was the only one in the room who wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty. The silence of the court broke not with a shout, but with the rhythmic, metallic thud of heavy work boots descending the stairs. Alara watched, breathless, as the man from the rafters approached the high priest. He was small compared to the towering hegemony lords, his flight jacket stained with grease and his face weathered by the radiation of a dozen suns. "I'm invoking the open ally clause," the human said. His voice was sandpaper and gravel, lacking the melodic resonance of the nobility. "You need a champion. I'm volunteering." A ripple of laughter, cruel and sharp, moved through the council. They looked at his blunt fingers and his lack of bioluminescent lineage. Yet, when Alara reached out, her fingers trembling, he didn't flinch at the black veins tracing her skin. He took her hand. His palm was hot, calloused, and vibrated with a steady, stubborn pulse that felt like a drumbeat in the dark. The soul bond snapped into place, not a shimmering tether of light, but a tether of raw, grounding heat. In the days that followed, Jax trained in the obsidian shadow of the arena. He didn't use a pulse blade or a gravity shield. Instead, he gripped a length of sharpened steel and carried that jagged piece of flint in his pocket like a prayer. He moved with a brutal, efficient economy that the hegemony's ritualists couldn't comprehend. Then came the day of the duel. Braxis the Hollow was a nightmare of chitin and hydraulic strength, a creature engineered for the sole purpose of ending lineages. Every time Jax was thrown against the wall, Alara felt the impact through the bond, a shuddering ache in her own ribs. The court watched with a morbid, detached fascination, already preparing the surrender documents. They had seen enough. The human was broken, and now, in the center of that scorched circle, under the judgment of 1,000 cold eyes, Jax didn't stay down. He used the giant's own momentum, a frantic, gasping burst of speed that bypassed the beast's armor. The steel found its mark. The neck seal hissed, and the titan fell. Silence. But Lara didn't wait for the adjudicators. She sprinted onto the floor, her royal robes trailing through the dust, reaching Jax just as his knees gave out. He was covered in soot and blood, but he was grinning a jagged, beautiful expression of triumph. "Told you," he wheezed, his head lolling against her shoulder. Refused to accept the script. In the aftermath, the Ravager ships drifted away from the system, bound by the ancient laws of the trial. The Council tried to speak of accidental victory and the need to return to the old ways of purity. But Alara stood over the body of her fallen father and silenced them. She didn't use a scepter. She held the piece of Terran flint high, its edges stained with the grit of the arena. She tore the old laws down. If the hegemony was to survive, it would not be through the color of its blood, but through the strength of its character. Months later, the star skimmer broke atmosphere, leaving the glittering spires of the capital behind. Alara sat in the co-pilot's seat, watching the stars blur into long streaks of light. On her brow, the imperial crown had been redesigned. At its center, nestled among the priceless void gems, sat a small, jagged piece of gray stone. It was a reminder that the most precious things in the galaxy aren't found in a lab or a lineage, but in the heart of someone who refuses to quit. If you believe that courage is worth more than a crown, then come back tomorrow for another chronicle of the extraordinary. What would you sacrifice to prove the world wrong?